Good morning, you're tuned into another edition of the Asia Gaming Brief face-to-face series. I'm speaking today with Paul Newson, Principal at Senet Advisory and a former regulator. Paul, great to have you on today.
Thanks, Felix. Great to be speaking with you.
So, I guess maybe just to start, for the people who don't know who you are, could you give us a bit of background on yourself?
Sure. Well, my career has largely been regulatory and public policy related. Of particular relevance, I think increasingly in Australia anyway, with the appetite for AML, I did spend 2 years with Australia's AML regulator and financial intelligence unit, AUSTRAC, leading one of their compliance teams, and also had the opportunity to lead the investigation and support the enforcement action. In fact, AUSTRAC's first enforcement action, which was against PayPal. So that's some pretty relevant experience, which is coming in handy, certainly in these dynamic times. Look, as you mentioned, probably my last significant role in government was as a Deputy Secretary in the New South Wales Department of Industry, and I did look after public policy and regulation for gambling and liquor and racing for a number of years. Look, I had a very short stint. I took a year off when I left government and had a very short stint at ASIC, where I was responsible for financial services regulation, looking after the banks, the conduct of the banks. But it really dawned on me in my short stint there that it's time to transition. It's time to transition to private practice and hopefully make a contribution, a valuable contribution to good practice, best practice, and what is leading practice, regulatory thinking and the art of regulation from being an advisor, from being a consultant. So here I am, and my Senate journey has commenced.
So I want to talk about the year past, the year of the pandemic. It's an event that has brought some considerable challenges to gaming operators, gaming suppliers. But I haven't yet really heard about, what are the plights that regulators have been facing in the last year. So, in Australia, what have you seen on the ground?
Yeah, very relevant, very relevant question. And look, let me answer it this way. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey, but 2019, IAGA had a conference in Jamaica, Montego Bay, Jamaica, and that was a smashing success. Introduced a whole range of new both regulators and industry to the association, and that discourse around advancing efficient and effective regulatory practice. But from that conference, we then dubbed the theme for the Boston conference, which was supposed to be in 2020. And it was all around disrupting the regulator, sparking innovation in regulatory practice. So, look, it wasn't with any particular foresight that we did that, but it's even now more relevant than perhaps what it was for 2020, even though that conference has been rescheduled to this year. I think for too long, the regulators haven't turned that lens inwards, haven't turned that lens to look at how do we innovate the art of regulation? How do we start to grasp some of this regulatory technology that has been so well put to use in the financial services space? So, look, I think COVID has accelerated and hopefully has accelerated that thinking, and hopefully we'll see that in practice more and more over coming months and years. So I think that's one thing they've been grappling with. How do we move away from this? It's been ventilated in recent months and over the last 18 months in Australia, this preoccupation with having a physical presence at casinos, having inspectors 24/7 at casinos. Well, look, my view on that is it's pedestrian. That they are generally occupied with mundane administrative tasks, and it's anything but intelligence-led or risk-based. So hopefully you smash those two things together, this appetite for innovation. How do we disrupt this pedestrian activity of regulators? How do we bring it into and compete with financial services regulation to make sure that we are getting efficient and effective regulation? I think the last 18 months has caused each regulator to really pause and think, how do we deliver on this, and where do we have to be focusing our effort? I think one inconvenient truth, one uncomfortable truth is that gambling regulators have been deprioritised or a low priority over the last number of years, and that's across all Australian jurisdictions. Too often, the organisational structures and capabilities are getting fettered with, are getting meddled with through machinery of government changes. So, unlike some organisations, they're having to compete with constant change, so they don't get the budget allocation for big IT spend, which is really what's necessary. So if anything, look, I'm hoping that the same aspiration for industry to be innovating their products, absolutely, but also innovating in responsible gambling. I'm hoping that same ambition has been grasped by the regulators and that they'll get a much better slice of the funding pie going forward.
I mean, what has to happen for them to actually be able to access more funding? I mean, it's not something that an individual regulator would able to just get, right? I mean, this is a government sort of thing, right?
Look, it's a difficult conversation, and that difficulty is only exacerbated by the pandemic environment and the massive hit to public funds that is just universal, not limited to New South Wales or Australia, but globally. So, look, just parking that to the side, I think what you need is a difficult issue. You need some spectacular failing. And look, I think we've had it. I think perhaps that the 60 Minutes report, Crown Unmasked, that's probably the catalyst. That's probably the kick in the pants that was necessary to jockey some people's attention and say this underfunding or defunding or dilution of gambling regulators has to stop. You can only siphon off adequate funding for so long. And please don't misinterpret me. I don't think industry needs to pay more. The regulators just need to be able to keep more. This is, in New South Wales alone, you're talking $9 billion or so, and government taxation of that is around $3 billion, give or take. So to be penny pinching with the gambling regulators and to be constantly meddling in their organisational structures and capability and leadership, look, I think we see what's spilling out of the Western Australian Royal Commission. I think that's what it is at its worst. And that is not good for government. It's not good for community confidence, and it's not in the public interest.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to definitely talk to you about what was happening in New South Wales, what happened in Victoria, and what's happening in Western Australia as well. I just kind of bring back to a news article that we wrote earlier this week, where AUSTRAC, you had 3 separate investigations into AML practices for Crown and for Star and for Sky City in Adelaide. I mean, what's your take on all that, and why now?
Yes, yeah. Look, I think I think there's quite a bit behind what's happening now, and perhaps not unkindly, you could frame it as a bit of a glut. There's now a glut in potential money laundering related enforcement actions. And I say potential because it's appropriate to be cautious. But there's certainly some concerns that have been raised and a number of concerns over a number of organisations. Look, I've said and I maintain that gambling regulators are largely state-based. I mean, you have ACMA has an important role federally, but largely state-based. And state-based gambling regulations interaction with the AML sphere has been messy in Australia over a number of years. I think it's fair to say that AUSTRAC in the past hasn't had either sufficient attention or resources allocated to the gambling sector. I think that's a fair observation. This glut of potential enforcement actions, look, I don't think it's desirable. I think ideally there would have been a more intensive effort and a more coordinated collaborative effort with the state-based gambling regulators to bolster, to build up the resilience, to harden the gambling sector against the risk of financial crime, against the risk of money laundering. So, look, I think that has been disappointing, and it's not how you'd want it to play out. Where there's an unwilling operator or an operator that has been unable to adequately implement its AML program or to effectively operationalise it, absolutely. There should be stiff penalties and significant intervention from the regulator. But at least partly, I think it's unfortunate that we have this glut. I would like to see, and we are starting to see, a far greater educative and far greater industry support from the AML regulator, which I think is really heartening. So, look, I think there's also some misunderstandings around when people make commentary, when the pundits are coming out and making commentary, there's often some conflation of why didn't the gambling regulator do X? And I've seen some of that levied at the Victorian regulator. I think people that make these quick comments misunderstand the regulatory arrangements in Australia, and gambling regulators, it's really quite spurious to make shallow comparisons with international jurisdictions. Take Nevada, like it's really just making a comparison. Australian gambling regulators don't have the status and powers of law enforcement. They just don't have that access to intelligence. They don't have those powers. They don't conduct physical or technical surveillance. The money laundering, the AML CTF regulator in Australia is Austrac. So there has been this overly messy interaction over a number of years, and gambling regulators have reasonably narrow responsibilities. They are not responsible for serious organised crime. In fact, they barely have a seat at the table. So, look, I think a lot could be done to improve those circumstances. And my point really is blunt, shallow comparisons with international regulators that often, and certainly in the case of Americans, states, will have law enforcement integrated or embedded in the regulator. And they view enforcement action as action of those police officers. So, look, I think there's some conflation occurs which doesn't help. I think the shift to providing more educative resources for industry, more risk assessment advice, and really wanting to bolster that resilience is a step in the right direction.
I mean, do you think that there's room for Australian regulators to get more of that enforcement power?
Look, I think you can have a policy conversation about it. There's no escaping. There's certainly some merits around having state-based regulation. But when you combine that with state-based gambling regulators and then state-based law enforcement and federal law enforcement, and then a federal financial intelligence unit and a federal AML CTF regulator, and then just the jockeying that happens between those different organisations strategically and operationally. And if one of those parties, which is the gambling regulators, don't have status as a law enforcement agency, generally speaking, look, I think there's some remedy that has to happen there. Ideally, you can make a cogent argument for having a greater federal role, but there's also some drawbacks to that. So, look, I think it's a policy question that needs to be grappled with, and I've got no doubt that from the WA Royal Commission and from the Royal Commission in Victoria particularly, that some of these issues are being well ventilated, well thought of behind the scenes, and then the public policy questions need to be grappled with.
So changing track once again, Paul, I understand you're organising a 5-day education program in Sydney this year in August. What can you tell us about that?
We're very excited. We had it scheduled for last year, but had to cancel it because of the pandemic, obviously. We're thrilled to be partnering with ICGR, the International Centre for Gaming Regulation, which is part of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So they're the big hitters. We're collaborating with them to bring this course to Sydney, to bring it to Australia. It's obviously carefully curated. We've looked at where are the gaps in gambling regulatory education offering, and how can we provide that. So it's definitely about the expert content. We're bringing out some distinguished people to be able to speak on this course, but it's also about really stoking this curiosity, really having these public policy discussions, having these debates. So as much as it's about hearing from the experts, it's also about attendees hearing from each other and participating in these discussions. And stoking curiosity, really trying to cultivate curious minds and build this compliance orientation. We announced earlier this week that we've got Sandra Douglas Morgan, a former chairwoman from the Nevada regulator. We've got Ian Hughes from GLI, the CEO of GLI Australia and the Chief Commercial Officer from GLI globally. We've got Austrac. It's appropriate Austrac's there. And we've got Bradley Brown, one of the national managers from Austrac's going to be speaking. ACMA, the Australian Communications Media Authority, is going to be there. Fiona Cameron from ACMA is going to be speaking with us. So it's a tremendous opportunity to hear direct from some of these leading experts, but also from the key Australian regulators. What is their regulatory posture? What are their priorities? What are the issues that are both known and emerging in the space? We're looking forward to a great mix of regulators and industry, and we're tremendously excited about bringing the event to Sydney in August.
Yep, 8th to 13th of August, and registrations are open, is that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Registrations are open now, so don't waste time. It is a prestigious course, and as I've been saying on social media, there's some exclusive merchandise which goes along with that.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Paul. I hope to catch up again soon, and I'll see you in August.
Thanks, Felix. I look forward to working with you and speak soon. Cheers.
And that was Paul Newson of Senet Advisory. And thanks again for joining Asia Gaming Brief's Face-to-Face series. Tune in every Friday as we speak to the industry's leading movers and shakers.